In 1964, a driver from Michigan pushed a top fuel dragster past 200 miles an hour for the first time in NHRA history. His name was Connie Kalitta, and they called him the Bounty Hunter. But this isn't only the story of one man, because over the next 60 years, the Kalitta name would run down the quarter mile in three different generations: a father, a son, and a nephew, all of them chasing the same few seconds of asphalt. They built a racing team. They built a world championship. And with the money that came off the racetrack, they built an entire cargo airline that still flies today. They also paid a price that few families in any sport have ever paid. And here's the thing that makes this family different from almost any other in racing. After the sport gave them everything, and then took something they could never get back, they didn't walk away. They stayed. This is the story of why. Connie Kalitta was born in New Baltimore, Michigan in 1938. He came up in the earliest, rawest days of Top Fuel, a time when the cars were still being invented run by run, and the men driving them were figuring out the limits by finding them the hard way. In those years, Top Fuel was about as close to the edge as motorsport got. The safety equipment was primitive, the engines were volatile, and every driver who strapped in understood the arithmetic. Connie Kalitta didn't just survive that era, he defined its front edge. He was a rugged individualist by every account, a builder who trusted his own ideas over anybody else's playbook. And he was fast. At the 1964 US Nationals, according to the record books, Kalitta became the first top fuel driver to cross 200 miles an hour at an NHRA event. That was only the beginning of what he'd do to the record book. Over his career, NHRA records credit Connie Kalitta with 10 national event wins, along with IHRA World Championships in 1979 and 1982. And in 1989, more than 2 decades after his first milestone, he did it again, becoming the first top fuel driver ever to reach 290 miles an hour, 25 years apart. The first man passed 200, and the first man passed 290. Very few drivers in any era stayed dangerous that long. But if you followed drag racing in the 1970s, there's a good chance you first heard the Kalitta name next to somebody else's. Connie Kalitta was the technical partner behind Shirley Muldowney, the driver who broke Top Fuel open for women, and the subject of one of our earlier episodes. He was the bounty hunter. She raced as the bounty huntress. And according to the accounts of that era, Kalitta served as her crew chief through the season that ended in her first world championship in 1977. So before the family dynasty even took shape, Connie Kalitta had already left a fingerprint on one of the most important careers the sport ever produced. And then there's the part of the story that has nothing to do with the starting line. In 1967, Connie Kalitta won a string of major races. And instead of spending the money the way most racers did, he bought an airplane. The story, as it's been told for decades, is almost too simple. Kalitta was already crossing the country to race. Ford executives realized he was flying the same routes their parts needed to travel, and asked if he'd carry freight along the way. That side arrangement became a business, and that business became an airline. Over the years, it grew, changed names, survived a bankruptcy, and flew hundreds of military support missions during the Gulf War. Today, it operates as Kalitta Air, a cargo airline flying heavy freight all over the world. Think about what that means for the racing team. Most independent operations in Top Fuel live and die by sponsorship, by convincing a company that the car is worth the money. The Kalittas built their own money machine. The airline could help keep the dragsters running when the sponsors couldn't. It's a detail that runs underneath the entire family story. The Kalittas were never just racers who happened to own airplanes. They were an operation that could fund itself. And that independence is part of how the name survived, in a class that has bankrupted far bigger teams. Connie Kalitta was inducted into the Motorsports Hall of Fame of America in 1992. Years later, in 2016, the NHRA gave him its first ever Lifetime Achievement Award. But a Lifetime Achievement Award usually marks the end of a story. For the Kalittas, it was closer to the middle, because by then, the founder had already put a second generation in the car. Scott Kalitta was Connie's son, and for a while they raced together, the father and the son in the same class on the same team. Then Scott stepped out of his father's shadow entirely. In 1994, Scott Kalitta won the NHRA Top Fuel World Championship. The next year, in 1995, he won it again. Back-to-back titles in the quickest class in the sport. The son hadn't just carried the family name, He'd done something his father, for all his records and all his speed, had never done in NHRA Top Fuel. He'd won the championship twice, and he'd done it for the family team, the same operation his father had built from a single dragster and a single airplane. When Scott Kalitta stood at the top of the Top Fuel standings, it wasn't only a driver's title. It was proof that the thing Connie started could be handed down and carried higher. Over his career, NHRA records credit Scott with 18 national event wins, 17 in Top Fuel, and 1 in Funny Car. By the mid 1990s, the Kalitta operation wasn't a one man team with a side business anymore. It was a two-generation dynasty, backed by an airline, with a two-time champion in the driver's seat. And it was about to add a third name. Doug Kalitta is Connie's nephew and Scott's cousin. He came to Top Fuel in 1998 after a career in open wheel racing, and he stepped straight into the family operation. Another Kalitta in another dragster wearing the same name down the same quarter mile. And Doug could drive. Almost immediately, he was a threat, qualifying up front, winning national events, finishing near the top of the standings year after year. By the 2000s, the Kalitta name was everywhere in Top Fuel. Connie, the founder, running the operation, Scott, the two-time champion, and Doug, the nephew, turning into one of the most consistent drivers in the entire class. Three generations of one family, all tied to the same team, all chasing the same title. This is the part of the story where a racing dynasty usually just keeps climbing. More wins, more seasons, maybe another championship. But that's not what happens next. If you follow this channel for the drivers, the machines, and the families that shaped drag racing, the stories the record book can't fully hold, take a second and subscribe. Because what this family did after the hardest day of its life is the real reason the Kalitta name still means what it does. On June 21st, 2008, Scott Kalitta was at Old Bridge Township Raceway Park in Englishtown, New Jersey, for the final round of qualifying at an NHRA national event. By then, he was a two-time champion, back in competition, driving a funny car. We're not going to replay what happened on that run, and we're not going to describe it. That's not what this channel does, and this family deserves better than that. Here is what matters, told the way the sport itself told it. According to the accounts of the day, an engine failure occurred at high speed near the end of the track, and the safety equipment that should have slowed the car was compromised. Scott Kalitta was killed. He was 46 years old. For a family that had spent 40 years inside the most dangerous seat in racing, the thing they always knew could happen had happened. He was a two-time world champion, a husband and a father, and by the accounts of the people who knew him, one of the most respected men in the pits. The sport didn't lose a statistic that day. It lost one of its own. And what the sport did next matters, because it's part of how this family's loss changed the lives of every driver who came after. Investigators pointed to a mechanical failure in the car, and in direct response to Scott Kalitta's death, the NHRA made some of the most significant safety changes in its modern history. Within weeks, it shortened its fastest classes, Top Fuel and Funny Car, from the traditional quarter mile to 1,000 feet, giving the cars far more room to stop. It added padded barriers, and the following season required new sensors designed to catch exactly the kind of failure that had occurred. Those changes are still in place today. Every Top Fuel and Funny Car driver who has raced since 2008 has raced on a shorter, safer track because of what happened to Scott Kalitta. To this day, the 1,000-foot rule is one of the most consequential safety decisions in modern drag racing. A line drawn on every fast track in the country, traced directly back to that afternoon in Englishtown. Scott Kalitta's name is on it, whether the record book says so or not. The family's loss became the sport's protection. Here is where you'd expect a family to step back. Nobody would have blamed the Kalittas for closing the shop, parking the cars, and living on the airline. They had already given the sport more than most families ever would. They didn't step back. Doug Kalitta kept racing. The team kept running. Connie, well into his 70s and 80s, kept working. The family that had every reason to leave the quarter mile stayed on it. That decision wasn't loud. There was no farewell tour, no grand statement. The trucks just kept rolling out to the next race, the way they had for 4 decades. In a sport where teams fold every season over money alone, a family choosing to keep going after a loss like that is its own kind of statement. And for Doug, staying meant chasing a title that kept slipping away. Because for all his consistency, all those wins, all those seasons near the front, The championship itself refused to come. Doug Kalitta finished the year as the runner-up in Top Fuel 6 different times. 6 times the season ended with a Kalitta in second place. In a sport built on a clock that doesn't care about your last name, being close for that long is its own kind of hard. Every year, the family put a fast car on the track. Every year, the title went to someone else. 20 years went by. Then 25. The founder had his records. The son had his 2 championships. But the nephew, the one still driving, still carrying the name every weekend, kept coming up one step short. Until he didn't. In 2023, at the season finale in Pomona, California, it all came down to a single run. Doug Kalitta lined up in a winner-take-all final round with the World Championship on the line. And this time, the clock came out in his favor. After 26 years in the sport, after 6 runner-up finishes, Doug Kalitta won his first NHRA Top Fuel World Championship. Think about everything folded into that one title. It was the championship Connie, the founder, had never won in NHRA Top Fuel. It came 15 years after the family lost Scott. It came for a driver so many people had started to believe would never quite get there. For the people who had followed this family through all of it, the records, the airline, the championships, and the loss, that night in Pomona carried a weight no stopwatch could print. The name that had been in the sport for 60 years was finally and undeniably on top of it again. And it wasn't a fluke or a last gasp. 2 years later, in 2025, Doug Kalitta did it again, a second Top Fuel World Championship, cementing a driver most fans now consider one of the best ever to sit in the class. The following year had already brought another kind of recognition. In March of 2024, Scott Kalitta was inducted into the International Drag Racing Hall of Fame, his championships and his place in the family's story honored for good. So look at the full line of this family. A father who was the first man past 200 miles an hour and built an airline out of his winnings. A son who won back-to-back world championships and gave his life to the sport that made the family's name. And a nephew who carried that name through the hardest years, took the losses and the near misses, and finally stood at the very top. Drag racing is a sport that measures everything in a few seconds of elapsed time. But there's one thing the clock has never been able to measure. And that's why a family keeps going back to the most dangerous seat in the sport, generation after generation, after it has already cost them so much. You can call it loyalty, or stubbornness, or love, or all three at once. Whatever it was, it kept one family tied to the same starting line across 6 decades, 3 generations, and a loss that would have ended most stories. The Kalittas never really answered that question in words. They answered it by staying. Next episode, the driver who walked away from a guaranteed fortune in another sport just to chase a record that had already killed men before him.